In a short while, we will two balanced budget amendments to the Constitution, or at least one of which will be a true balanced budget amendment. One of those amendments, Senate Joint Resolution 10, the amendment supported by every Senate Republican, addresses the fundamental crisis of our time. That is a crisis of exploding debt caused by excessive spending. The other amendment does not address that crisis and therefore cannot put this country back on a sound fiscal footing. The votes we cast today will tell the American people whether we honestly acknowledge the fiscal crisis posed by our $15 trillion national debt and whether we are serious about prescribing an effective cure. Exploding budget deficits and skyrocketing national debt are symptoms of an addiction to overspending. A real solution must address the real cause of this crisis, not just its symptoms. Congress will not kick its overspending addiction alone, but only if required to do so by the Constitution itself. One of the amendments before us today, S.J. Res. 24, simply cannot be a solution because it does not address the overspending that causes this crisis. This amendment, offered by my colleague from Colorado on behalf of the Democrats, Senator Udall, purports to require balanced budgets, but for purely political reasons, explicitly exempts significant portions of the very government spending that will most aggressively drive our future debt. The Democratic alternative sets no overall limit on government spending, allowing Congress to continue spending with impunity. The Democratic alternative does nothing to restrict the propensity of Congress and the President to raise taxes on families and businesses as a way of compensating for their failure to reduce spending and in order to fuel more spending in the future. In fact, as my friend Senator Kyl pointed out yesterday, the Democratic alternative actually makes it harder to cut taxes. And to top it off, the Democrats' amendment not only sets no limits on Congress raising taxes, but it appears to allow judges to raise taxes to balance the budget. In other words, the Democratic alternative allows Congress to continue doing exactly what has caused this crisis in the first place. It allows members of Congress committed to a tax and spend philosophy to continue sending taxpayer dollars to special interests at the expense of the general fiscal health of this country. The so-called solution that continues to enable out-of-control spending is no solution at all. Maintenance of this tax and spend status quo is the priority of those who support the Democrat alternative. Just listen to their criticism of my amendment, S.J. Res. 10, the one supported by all Republican senators, every one of us. The Democrats criticize my amendment's requirement that Congress balance its books as too stringent. They criticize it for not allowing more stimulus spending. My gosh. And they criticize it for not allowing easy tax increases. The people of Utah, and most Americans for that matter, would respond that these are the very restrictions that Congress needs. They would say that these restrictions are long overdue and would be positive additions to our Constitution. So it is no wonder that the advocates of the worn-out philosophy of tax and spend view the provisions of S.J. Res. 10, our constitutional amendment, as a threat. They are a threat. Our amendment provisions are a threat to those whose only plan is to sit on their hands while our debt continues to skyrocket. The strong balanced budget amendment offered by the Republicans directly addresses the real cause of our budget crisis and offers equally direct solutions. It requires supermajorities. That doesn't mean you can't do things. It just says you have to have supermajorities to raise taxes. It means it requires wide bipartisan agreement for deficit or excess spending, as well as for raising either taxes or the debt limit. I would note that a supermajority to raise the debt limit was in the balanced budget amendment that passed the Senate back in 1982. I know because I was the one pushing it. It passed the Senate. Our amendment limits both spending and the tax increases that fuel more spending. This is really more than a balanced budget amendment. It is a fiscal discipline amendment or a constitutional amendment for limited government. Much of the Western world now faces a debt crisis. The Eurozone is nearly reaching the point of no return. The United States is closing in on that same point of no return, with our total debt already equal to 100% of our entire economy, of our GDP. The national debt now amounts to about $48,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. Interest payments alone on this debt are now greater than spending on most other federal programs, and would be even higher if interest rates were not today at historic lows. Annual budget deficits today are larger than the entire national debt when I introduced my first balanced budget amendment. Let me say that again. Annual budget deficits, just the deficit this year and last year, just standing alone, this year's budget deficit and the annual budget deficits of this president are larger than the entire national debt when I first introduced the first balanced budget amendment in 1979, and 10 times higher than when the Senate last voted on a balanced budget amendment in 1997. More than 2 centuries ago, America's founders warned of the dangers of debt. Thomas Jefferson, the forebear of the Democratic Party, said that public debt is the greatest of dangers to be feared. He'd be aghast at what Democrats are trying to sell here today. Alexander Hamilton said that there ought to be perpetual, anxious, and unceasing effort to reduce debt as fast as possible. And John Adams said that the experience of other countries that accumulate debt should prevent us from doing so ourselves. He might as well have been speaking about Europe today. He'd be appalled at what we're doing around here. Watching the failure of Congress and the President to get spending and debt under control, these founding fathers must be turning over in their graves. And I believe that we continue to reject their wisdom at our peril. And despite all the evidence, opponents continue to claim that Congress will make the tough fiscal choices by itself, that Congress does not need any help after so many years of failure that amounts to fiddling while our fiscal house is burning to the ground. That's the argument that they make. Closing their eyes, shutting their ears, and repeating the mantra that Congress does not need a constitutional amendment is exactly what got us to the edge of the cliff where we are standing today, and which we're about to go over if we don't get some restraints put on around here. If spending were a drug, Congress would be a very pathetic addict. An addict ignores the evidence and denies that he has a problem. An addict claims over and over that he cannot stop his addictive behavior anytime he wants. Or that he can stop his addictive behavior anytime he wants. But like a real addict, Congress cannot kick the habit on its own. Congress needs some help, and the Constitution is the way to get that help. And the Founding Fathers would have loved this amendment. Think of Senate Joint Resolution 10 as a constitutional intervention. It will require not only that the federal budget be balanced, but that it be balanced in the right way. When we vote on these amendments, senators will demonstrate where they stand on the great crisis of our time. Voting against any balanced budget amendment simply endorses the status quo. It ignores the evidence and pretends everything is fine even as we head for the cliff. And this is the only amendment that deserves the title of Balanced Budget Constitutional Amendment. But voting for the Democrats' alternative, Senate Joint Resolution 24, also endorses the status quo because it barely touches the symptom, budget deficits and debt, while ignoring the cause, government spending. Without covering all government spending and without setting real limits on spending and taxes, the Democrats' alternative does little more than put a Band-Aid on the problem. And it isn't even a good Band-Aid that holds. The only proposal before us that effectively responds to our budget crisis is Senate Joint Resolution 10. It is the only proposal that addresses the real cause of the unbalanced budgets that are dragging us into the fiscal quicksand. This crisis threatens national security, economic prosperity, and maybe most important of all, individual liberty. Congress will not solve this crisis by itself. Senate Joint Resolution 10 is the only solution that addresses not only the symptoms of our fiscal crisis, but the cause as well. These are the facts. These are simply the facts, and I encourage my colleagues to support Senate Joint Resolution 10 today. Now, I heard the distinguished Majority Whip talking here earlier, and just for a minute, I think he was saying, why do this? You know you can't win. Well, we don't know we can't win. But even if we can't, some fights are worth fighting, especially when our national security, economic prosperity, and individual liberty are at stake. And that's what we're living with right now. The American people need to know where we stand, whether we will ever do anything real or do something real about our addiction to overspending. That is the bankruptcy of our country right now, the addiction to overspending. Our amendment ends that addiction. It gives you 5 years to get there, so it's a reasonable provision, but it does force you to get there. The Democrat amendment doesn't even attack the real problems. And it's there for I wish purposes. It's there so that Democrats can say, well, we voted for a balanced budget amendment, even though it has really basically little to do with balancing the budget. I was enamored with the talk of the Democrat budget chairman yesterday, Senator Conrad from North Dakota. He went through all the problems we have and how deep they are and how problematic they are and what an addiction it is and all of that, and then said, but we can do it by just doing what's right under the Constitution and forcing ourselves to do what's right and just balance the budget without a balanced budget amendment. He couldn't have made a better case for the balanced budget amendment, because I've been here 35 years and I can say there hasn't been any real effort except during the mid-90s to do that, and that was when the first Republican House of Representatives and Senate in over 40 years took place. And it was when they did have a president, Bill Clinton, who recognized that, hey, the time has come to do something about spending. Now, I've got to give him credit for that, in contrast to our current president, who just demands more taxes and more spending all the time. There isn't anything or any person he wouldn't tax if he could get away with it, except those they call unable to pay any taxes at all, and nobody wants to tax them. Fact of the matter is, I think the distinguished Budget Committee chairman made a tremendous case for our amendment. Like I say, we've been going on too long, way too long. Back in 1997, we came within one vote of passing this amendment. Well, it was twice now. And remember, in '82, we actually passed the amendment, but Tip O'Neill and the Democrats killed it in the House at that time. But in 1997, we came within one vote. I actually had the votes as I walked to the floor, and then one of our weak-kneed Republicans, who was threatened by the unions, who had been high up on the endorsement list, who wanted to be seen every time we had a press conference on this, buckled and voted the other way, and we lost. Had we won that amendment in 1997, we wouldn't be in this colossal mess we're in today. And frankly, I, for one, hope we can get out of that mess. And the only way we're going to is through a constitutional amendment that does what this amendment that we're presenting actually calls for. I just do not believe that our friends on the other side are ever going to quit taxing and spending. And I have 35 years to prove it, except when the first Republican Congress in over 40 years came into being, and they had a president who worked with them. A Democrat president, by the way. I wish we had a Democrat president here who would work with us. He'd get on in history as one of the most popular presidents in history if he would do so. But no, he wants to tax and he wants to spend. And frankly, I'm fed up with it. And I think a lot of people are fed up with it. And the people out in the interlands are all fed up with it. And they realize we need to put some restraint on Congress that they have to live up to. That doesn't mean you can't get a supermajority to raise taxes, or you can't get a supermajority to raise the debt limit, or you can't get a supermajority to an undeclared war, to give a good reason why our friends on the other side might want to support this. But it does mean that there will be restraints that will work and will keep this country secure and free. With that, I reserve the balance of our time and ask that any time be divided equally.